This morning at St. Peter's Basilica, the faithful lining up to say goodbye. At the center, facing the pews, the coffin carrying Pope Francis.
I think his message of peace and tolerance is one that we could all subscribe to.
His message was coherent with his entire pontificate, a call for peace.
The Vatican fell silent as the bells tolled. Pope Francis, the beloved shepherd of over 1 billion souls, had breathed his last. Just a day earlier, he waved gently to crowds in St. Peter's Square, his eyes soft yet unwavering, his final public moments cloaked in quiet grace.
Pope Francis is known as one of the most humble papal figures in the Catholic Church's history.
As word of his passing rippled across the globe, millions were left stunned. But in those final sacred hours, he left a message so intimate, heartbreaking, and deeply human that it would echo far beyond the marble walls of the Holy See. Pope Francis's last day among the faithful. No one imagined that Easter Sunday, March 30th, 2025, would be Pope Francis's final public appearance. Under a soft Roman sky, tens of thousands of faithful gathered in St. Peter's Square, some arriving at dawn, eager for a glimpse of the beloved pontiff. Though frail and confined to a wheelchair, he remained fully present. As he was slowly driven through the square, he raised his hand in blessing, smiling warmly at children lifted toward him by parents, and pausing to offer special attention to infants brought forward by guards and clergy. His voice had grown weak in recent months, so his Easter message was read aloud by an aide while the Pope sat quietly beside him, eyes closed in prayer. The message was simple, yet powerful. An urgent call for peace in Gaza, and Ukraine, a condemnation of the great thirst for death, fueling modern wars. That moment, unassuming yet profound, would mark his final public communication to the world. Just a few hours later, on the morning of Easter Monday, March 31st at 7:35 a.m. local time, the Vatican released the stunning news. Pope Francis had died in his private residence.
Pope Francis, the first Latin American leader of the Roman Catholic Church, has died.
It sent shockwaves around the globe. Despite his visibly weakening health, few could have guessed that the man who had so recently waved to crowds would be gone so soon. His health had taken a serious downturn in February 2025, when he was admitted to the Gemelli Hospital in Rome with pneumonia affecting both lungs. This was particularly dangerous given his medical history. Decades earlier, as a young man in Argentina, he had a part of one lung removed following a severe respiratory infection. Still, in typical Francis fashion, he had downplayed his condition, reassuring followers that he was just a bit tired and would soon return to his duties. Those close to him, however, had noticed subtle signs of decline. The Pope, known for his resilience, had begun to cancel more public events, and the twinkle in his eye had been replaced by a quiet weariness. But his Easter appearance gave many hope that he was recovering. That made his sudden death all the more jarring. As news spread, Rome came to a near standstill. BBC correspondent David Giglioni described a surreal scene. People sprinting toward the Vatican in disbelief, many weeping openly in the streets. Pilgrims dropped to their knees, clutching rosaries. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica tolled solemnly, announcing that a spiritual era had come to an end. The story of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who would become Pope Francis, was unlike any in modern papal history. Born on December 17, 1936, in Buenos Aires to Italian immigrants who had fled Mussolini's fascist regime, he led an ordinary working-class life. Before entering the seminary, he worked as a nightclub bouncer and a chemical technician. His calling came not with grandeur, but with humility. He joined the Jesuit order, which was known for intellectual rigor and service to the poor, and over the decades rose steadily within the Church. In 2013, following the unexpected resignation of Pope Benedict XVI.
So just how momentous is Benedict's decision to resign? Well, the last time a pope stepped down, Henry V was about to fight the Battle of Agincourt.
He was elected the 266th Pope, becoming the first from the Americas, the first Jesuit and the first non-European to sit on the throne of St. Peter in over 1,200 years. Acts of deep compassion and simplicity defined his papacy. He chose not to live in the lavish papal apartments, but in the modest Vatican guest house. He washed the feet of prisoners, visited migrant camps, and hugged the sick and disfigured without hesitation. He championed environmental justice and stood with those society often ignored: the poor, the displaced, and the forgotten. Even as his health waned, Francis remained a figure of moral courage and spiritual integrity. But what kind of pope chooses humility over power and changes even the rituals of death? Stay tuned to find out. The Pope who changed even death. Pope Francis's final Easter message, delivered just one day before his passing on March 31, 2025, was more than a seasonal address. It was a reflection of everything he had stood for throughout his remarkable papacy. Though his voice had grown too weak to speak, his words, read aloud by an aide, echoed with urgency and compassion. He called for peace in war-torn regions, aid for the starving, and a world where freedom of religion, thought, and expression were not just ideals, but lived realities. It was a closing chapter that encapsulated the soul of his leadership, one deeply rooted in empathy and justice. His death set into motion a series of ancient Vatican rituals, carefully preserved through centuries of papal tradition. Normally, the first step is the official confirmation of the Pope's passing by the Camerlengo, or Chamberlain of the Holy Roman Church. This solemn moment includes calling out the Pope's baptismal name 3 times, in Francis's case, Jorge Mario, and upon receiving no answer, declaring the Pope officially deceased. Next, the papal ring known as the Fisherman's Ring, a symbol of spiritual authority, is ceremoniously destroyed, marking the end of his reign. Traditionally, the embalmed body of the Pope is placed on a catafalque, a raised platform inside St. Peter's Basilica, where the public is invited to come and pay their final respects. The funeral is rich with symbolism, including the use of 3 coffins, one made of cypress wood, another of lead, and the last of oak, each representing purity, strength, and the enduring legacy of the papacy. But Pope Francis, true to his lifelong rejection of excess and preference for humility, reshaped even these ancient customs. Before his death, Francis had made clear he did not want the grandeur and pomp that accompanied most papal farewells. There would be no elaborate catafalque, no triple-layered coffins. Instead, he requested a simple wooden coffin lined with zinc, humble yet dignified. Rather than lying on public display, his body would remain inside the coffin, the lid gently removed for mourners to view him one last time.
The coffin holding the body of Pope Francis has now been sealed. That's a rite of the closing of the coffin taking place in the Vatican City.
It was deeply personal and consistent with the image he had always projected. A pope who walked with the people, not above them. Perhaps the most surprising departure from tradition, however, is his final resting place. While nearly all popes of the last century have been buried in the Vatican grotto beneath St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Francis will rest in the Basilica of St. Mary Major in Rome. Located in the heart of the city, this was not a random choice. St. Mary Major held deep personal meaning for Francis, who would often visit the basilica,
favorite basilica of Pope Francis, who has visited it more than 100 times,
to pray before and after international trips, and whose devotion to the Virgin Mary was widely known. By choosing to be buried outside Vatican walls, he ensured he would remain physically accessible to the people of Rome, a symbolic gesture, even in death, of his commitment to be close to the everyday faithful. The Basilica, one of the 4 major papal churches, sits where the city breathes and moves, among markets, tourists, pilgrims, and the poor. exactly the kind of people he had always drawn near to. As the world absorbed the news of his passing, tributes flooded in from every continent. Leaders from across the political and religious spectrum, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, secular, spoke of a man who had reshaped the moral voice of global leadership. But what does it mean when a pope chooses to rest among the people, not the powerful? Keep watching to find out. Echoes of a Gentle Giant. As the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang solemnly, they carried more than the sound of mourning. They echoed the life and legacy of a man who touched the world in ways no one could have predicted. Pope Francis, the pontiff, who once introduced himself as a bishop from the ends of the earth, had passed away just one day after his final Easter message. His death, during the holiest season of the Christian calendar and amid a Jubilee year that had drawn millions of pilgrims to Rome, left a void felt far beyond the walls of the Vatican. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen reflected on how Francis had reached far beyond the confines of Catholicism, inspiring millions with a humility that never sought praise and a boundless compassion for the poor and forgotten. Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, visibly moved during her statement, recalling the personal privilege of his friendship. "He called on us to find the courage to change course," she said. An echo of one of Francis's most repeated pleas, that humanity rediscover its heart. Just hours before his passing, U.S. Vice President Vance had sat with Francis in what would become the Pope's final private meeting. Struck by the Pope's quiet wisdom, Vance later shared his condolences with the global Christian community, saying, "My heart goes out to the millions who loved him, who drew strength from his example." It was a sentiment shared by leaders of all faiths, political views, and cultures. From England, the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, painted a deeply human portrait of Francis, not just as a holy figure, but as a man full of life. "He was witty, warm, and wonderful to be around," he said, adding that his presence had a way of making everyone feel seen. While the world grieved, the Vatican turned its attention to the sacred traditions that must follow the death of a pope. Over the next 9 days, a period of mourning and prayer, known as Novem Dialis, will be observed. Afterward, the College of Cardinals, princes of the Church from all over the globe, will gather in Rome for the papal conclave. Behind the locked doors of the Sistine Chapel under Michelangelo's Great Ceiling, they will deliberate and vote in secrecy. No contact with the outside world is permitted until a new pontiff is chosen. When that moment comes and a name receives a 2/3 majority, a plume of white smoke will rise from the chapel's chimney. The ancient words, "Habemus Papam," "We have a pope," will ring across St. Peter's Square, signaling to the world that a new spiritual leader has been chosen.
In 2013, the famous Habemus Papam was pronounced by the Frenchman Jean-Louis Tauran, and in this conclave, another Frenchman will have this honor.
But whoever steps into those white vestments next will inherit a nearly impossible task, following in the footsteps of a pope who redefined what it meant to serve. From the slums of Buenos Aires to the marble halls of the Vatican, Francis never stopped being the priest of the poor. He championed causes others shied away from: climate justice, migration, economic inequality, and challenged the Church itself to become more merciful, more inclusive, and more real. His final Easter message, delivered through trembling breath, was not just a call for peace. It was a reminder that mercy must remain at the center of everything. As millions gather in Rome to mourn, reflect, and pray, Pope Francis leaves behind more than memories. He leaves a call to action, a vision for the Church and the world that refuses to die with him. The tears behind the throne. But Francis's voice, which had stirred the hearts of millions throughout his papacy, would not fall silent with his death. In a message recorded weeks before his passing, intended only to be heard after he had returned home to the Father, Pope Francis offered one last gift to the world, a confession not of doctrine or dogma, but of truth. It was not a statement wrapped in ceremony, but a trembling reflection from a man who had spent his life walking the delicate line between faith and failure. "My beloved brothers and sisters," he began, his tone weary yet resolute, "if you are hearing these words, it means I have gone home." He stripped away all titles, all vestments of authority. He was no longer the Pope. He spoke now simply as Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a man who had laughed, wept, struggled, and prayed like anyone else. His words carried the weight of a soul unburdening itself in its final hour. With startling honesty, Francis shared what had long stirred in the depths of his heart, a pain that had haunted him during quiet nights in the Apostolic Palace, a burden he could no longer take to the grave. He spoke of a spiritual sickness, an invisible fog that had drifted silently into sacred places, cloaking them in shadow. "I have seen this sickness," he admitted, "not only in the world's corridors of power, but within our church." His voice trembled as he recounted the cries of victims, the wounded souls who had come to him not with rage, but with trembling hope. Some whispered their pain in secret, others never made it that far. Behind the grandeur of cathedrals and the solemnity of processions, Francis revealed, were forces that had worked in darkness, men who wore cassocks but sought power, who prayed in public yet betrayed their vows in private. These were not vague suspicions. "There are documents," he said, "real ones, names, testimonies, files that had once passed through his hands, some too late to change their outcome." There was no theatrical anger in his voice, only deep sorrow and a desire to free the Church from the weight of its silence. "Sometimes I failed," he confessed. "Sometimes I was silent too long." But now, with time running out, he chose transparency over tradition. He spoke not to tear down, but to cleanse, to purify what had been left to fester in silence for too long. The image of the Church, he reminded the world, is not the wealth of its treasures, nor the grandeur of its altars. It is Christ, bruised, broken, and crucified. And Christ, Francis said, did not hide his wounds. So must the Church. His plea was not for vengeance, but for repentance, not for fear, but for courage. "Let my final words not be of condemnation," he said, "but of clarity." As the recording played for the first time within the Vatican's inner circle, those present were struck by its quiet gravity. It was as if he had returned, for a moment, to guide them through the very reckoning he had always known must come. He spoke of prayer rooms turned into strategy halls, of sacred silence replaced by backdoor negotiations, of retirements made suspicious by timing. He did not name names in this final message. He didn't have to. Francis ended with an apology, not for failing to be perfect, but for the times he couldn't act quickly enough, for the cries he had heard too late. He said he remembered their faces during prayer, especially at night when the marble corridors of the palace grew still and the conscience grew loud. Some he had helped, some he could only mourn. And as his words reached the ears of the faithful and the cynical alike, they carried not just confession, but a call to light. But what if a pope's final message revealed secrets too heavy for marble walls to hold? This changes everything. The weight of silence. As his final words echoed through the marble halls of the Vatican, Pope Francis turned inward. His voice, heavy with emotion, grew quieter. No longer the voice of a leader, but of a man, flawed, burdened, and reaching for redemption.
He's somebody that I felt was kind of trying to hold the entire world together.
There were times, he admitted gently, when I chose silence, not from indifference, but from fear. Not fear of God, but fear of the harm the truth might bring, of what might collapse if certain doors were opened. He spoke not in defense, but with the humility of one who had worn a crown of thorns rather than gold. The burden of the papacy, he confessed, weighed deeply on his conscience. In Rome's apostolic palace behind closed doors, he had wrestled with choices, moments when justice clashed with mercy and truth with self-preservation. Sometimes he waited too long. Sometimes his silence spoke louder than he intended. "I listened to voices urging caution," he said, voices that said, "Protect the church's image. Be careful." But too often, he admitted, he ignored the voice that mattered most, the voice of Christ calling from the shadows. He remembered the letters, some from victims, some from broken clergy, others from believers losing faith. He read them in the quiet of the night, knowing each word carried pain. Some letters he answered, some he left unanswered, not from coldness, but because he didn't know how. He had believed reform could come gently, but now, standing at the edge of eternity, he saw that silence can deepen wounds. "I once believed patience was a virtue," he said, "but truth must come first. Only then can healing begin." His voice softened as he recalled his weaknesses. "I was not always the Peter the world needed," he confessed. "Sometimes I was only Simon, the one still learning to walk in faith. Yet even Peter failed, and Christ still chose him. He hoped his failures might become seeds of truth for those who would lead after him." Then came the hardest truth, the suffering buried deepest, not caused by outsiders, but by those inside the church. "They were supposed to be shepherds," he whispered, "but some became predators, children, women, men, abused by the very ones meant to protect them." Their pain, he said, was hidden beneath layers of denial. "I saw them," he said. "I wept with them. And I carry them still." His words were not a defense. They were not an explanation. They were a plea for truth, for justice, and above all, for grace. But what do you think happens when a pope, at the edge of eternity, confesses his deepest regrets and exposes hidden wounds within the church? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe.